Julian Vance stood by the floor-to-ceiling window of his penthouse office, looking down at the glittering skyline of the city he practically owned. At 32, he was the undisputed king of Vance Global, a corporate empire built on ruthless efficiency and cold calculation. But tonight the ice in his veins was useless. The biggest merger of his career was slipping through his fingers. The overseas investors, an old money conglomerate, had one archaic stipulation for the billion-dollar deal. They wanted a family man, a stable, married executive, not a notorious bachelor whose face was plastered across the tabloids with a different supermodel every month. He had exactly 48 hours to produce a fiancée, or the deal was dead. He rubbed his temples, the silence of the empty executive floor suddenly suffocating. That was when he heard it, the soft hum of a vacuum cleaner shutting off in the adjacent boardroom, followed by a quiet, exasperated voice. If they merge the subsidiary before clearing the offshore liabilities, they are walking into a massive tax trap. It is a terrible strategy. Julian froze. He stepped out of his office and walked toward the boardroom. Standing there was the night cleaner, holding a dust cloth, staring intensely at the whiteboard where his lawyers had mapped out the merger. She was wearing a faded grey uniform, her dark hair tied in a messy knot, but her eyes were sharp, scanning the complex financial diagrams like she was reading a children's book. The billionaire heard one sentence, and his life changed forever. "Who are you?" Julian asked, his voice echoing in the large room. She did not jump or cower like most of his employees did when he spoke. She turned slowly, her posture straight, unbothered by the fact that the most powerful man in the city was staring her down. "I am the person cleaning up your mess, Mr. Vance," she replied evenly, tossing the dust cloth into her cart. Literally and, it seems, financially. Julian stepped closer, his imposing figure usually enough to intimidate anyone into silence. "How do you know about offshore tax liabilities?" Ilara Thorne looked at him, her expression guarded. Her past was a locked box she had thrown into the ocean years ago, and she had no intention of opening it for a man who wore suits that cost more than her annual rent. "Anyone who reads the Financial Times can spot a bad deal," she said smoothly. "You have a loophole in Section 4. I suggest you tell your lawyers to actually earn their exorbitant fees. Good night, Mr. Vance." She tried to walk past him, but Julian stepped into her path. In that brief moment, the scent of vanilla and rain hit him, a stark contrast to the sterile smell of the office. He looked at her face, truly looked at it. Beneath the exhaustion and the harsh fluorescent lights, she had a quiet, undeniable elegance. A sudden, insane idea formed in his mind. "Wait," Julian said, his voice dropping to a low, commanding register. "I need to hire you. For a different position." "I do not do executive assistants," Ilara replied, keeping her chin high. "I do not need an assistant," Julian said, his eyes locking onto hers. "I need a fiancé." The silence that followed was heavy. Ilara stared at him, searching for the punchline, but his dark eyes were completely serious. "You have lost your mind," she stated flatly. "I am perfectly sane," Julian countered, pulling a sleek silver pen from his pocket and tapping it against his palm. "I need a convincing partner to secure a merger. You need money. I saw the eviction notice sticking out of your locker last week. I pay attention to everything in my building. Be my fiancé for 3 months. Play the part at dinners, smile for the cameras, and when the ink is dry on the contract, I will give you $2 million. Ilara felt her breath catch. $2 million. It was enough to finally disappear properly, to ensure the people she was hiding from could never find her. But taking money from a man like Julian Vance was a dangerous game. She crossed her arms, her pride flaring. "I am not a prop you can buy to impress your investors," she said, her voice dripping with disdain. "You think, because you have a limitless bank account, you can purchase human beings." "I think," Julian stepped closer, the space between them evaporating, "that we both have a problem. And I am offering a very lucrative solution. No strings, no real emotions, just a business transaction." She looked into his eyes, seeing the desperation masked by arrogance. "Fine," she whispered, her heart hammering against her ribs, "but we do this my way. I do not wear your ridiculous designer collars, and I do not pretend to be some submissive trophy." Julian felt a strange spark of satisfaction. "Deal," he murmured. The transition into his world was brutal and swift. 2 days later, Ilara found herself standing in a cavernous penthouse that felt more like a museum than a home. The contract had been signed in a cold, sterile meeting with his lawyers. There was no romance, no warmth, just 50 pages of non-disclosure agreements and behavioral clauses. Julian walked into the living room, adjusting the cuffs of his tailored tuxedo. He stopped, his breath catching in his throat. Ilara stood by the window, wearing a simple, deep emerald gown his stylist had provided. She had refused the heavy makeup and the diamond necklace he had selected, opting instead for a bare neck and her hair falling in soft, natural waves. She looked breathtaking, radiating a quiet power that made the expensive room seem cheap. "You refused the diamonds," Julian noted, his voice tighter than usual. "I am your fake fiancé, Julian, not a chandelier," she replied, turning to face him. Her use of his first name sent a strange jolt through his chest. "I do not need your jewels to prove my worth." Julian stared at her, his calculated control slipping for a fraction of a second. Before he could respond, the penthouse elevator dinged, and his cousin, Silas Vance, stepped out. Silas was the vice president of the company, a man whose ambition was matched only by his bitterness over Julian holding the top spot. Silas stopped, his eyes narrowing as he took in Ilara. "Well, well, so this is the mysterious woman who finally managed to trap the great Julian Vance." Julian immediately stepped closer to Ilara, his hand wrapping possessively around her waist. The heat of his touch startled her, but she did not pull away. "This is Ilara," Julian said, his voice turning to steel. "And I suggest you watch your tone, Silas." Silas smiled, a cold reptilian stretch of the lips. "Of course. I just find it fascinating. She seems so unexpected. I look forward to getting to know everything about her." As Silas walked away, Ilara felt a chill run down her spine. She looked up at Julian, seeing the tight clench of his jaw. The game had officially begun, and she suddenly realized that pretending to love Julian Vance might be the most dangerous thing she had ever done. The investor dinner was a battlefield disguised as a banquet. Silas watched her like a hawk, waiting for her to slip up, waiting for the poorly educated night cleaner to reveal her true colors. Instead, Ilara navigated the conversation with the overseas executives, not like a trophy wife, but like a seasoned diplomat. When the lead investor questioned the aggressive expansion timeline of the merger, Ilara did not just smile and nod appropriately. She leaned forward, her voice calm and authoritative, outlining a staggered integration strategy that minimized risk and maximized quarterly returns. The entire table fell into a stunned silence. Julian could not tear his eyes away from her. The fierce intellect she had displayed in the boardroom days ago was now wrapped in emerald silk, and it was entirely intoxicating. Later that night, the heavy mahogany doors of the penthouse closed behind them, shutting out the blinding flashes of the paparazzi. Ilara let out a long, heavy breath and kicked off her high heels, rubbing her aching feet with a wince. Julian watched her from the shadows of the hallway. He turned and walked into the massive kitchen, returning a few minutes later to hand her a warm mug of chamomile tea. She looked at the mug, then up at him, her defenses lowering for just a fraction of a second. She took it without a word, her fingers brushing his. It was a small, quiet gesture, devoid of cameras, contracts, and the heavy burden of their arrangement. For a moment, sitting in the dimly lit living room, the ruthless billionaire and the woman he had hired were just two exhausted people finding solace in the silence. But the fragile peace shattered 3 days later. Julian had been digging. The sharp, analytical mind Ilara possessed did not match a life spent emptying trash cans, and his pride could not handle a puzzle he could not solve. He confronted her in his private study, dropping a beige folder onto his desk. It contained a heavily redacted financial history and a sealed corporate file his private investigator had managed to unearth. He demanded the truth, his voice vibrating with the command of a man who owned everything around him. Ilara looked at the folder, her hands trembling not with fear, but with a suppressed, blinding rage. "You want to know why I understand offshore liabilities, Julian?" she asked, her voice dangerously quiet, cutting through the heavy air of the room. "My father was Richard Thorne, the founder of Thorne Maritime. The color drained from Julian's face. Thorn Maritime was his first major acquisition. It was a hostile takeover, brutal and merciless, designed to liquidate assets and crush the competition. He had dismantled the company piece by piece, never looking back at the human cost of his victory. "You destroyed him," she continued, the tears she refused to shed making her eyes shine like glass. "You stripped his life's work for parts, and the debt broke him. I did not take your deal because I wanted your money, Julian. I took it because I wanted to look the great Julian Vance in the eye and see if you were really as hollow as they said. And you are." The silence in the study was deafening. Julian had built his entire empire on ruthlessness, but looking at the absolute devastation in the eyes of the woman he was dangerously close to falling for, his past victories felt like ashes in his mouth. He did not yell. He did not offer her a check to make the pain go away. He simply stepped back, the invisible wall between them slamming back into place, heavier and colder than before. The following week was an exercise in silent warfare. They attended galas, smiled brightly for the press, and never spoke a single word behind closed doors. Yet Julian found himself watching her constantly. He started leaving a fresh cup of dark roast coffee on the kitchen counter for her every morning, exactly the way she liked it, without a single note. He cancelled a high-profile golf tournament just to stay in the penthouse, sitting in his armchair while she read on the sofa, existing in the same orbit, silently begging for a forgiveness he did not know how to ask for. But Silas had not been idle. The vice president had noticed the chilling distance between the happy couple, and he had resources of his own. Silas cornered Ilara in the empty glass-walled hallway of Vance Global while Julian was locked in a board meeting. Silas leaned against the wall, a wicked, triumphant smile playing on his lips as he held up a sleek digital tablet. "It took some deep digging, but I found the missing pieces of your little tragic puzzle, Miss Thorne," Silas whispered, stepping into her personal space. "The overseas investors will not sign this billion-dollar merger if they find out Julian is parading around a victim of his own corporate slaughter. It is a massive public relations nightmare, a total fraud. So here is the new deal. You are going to stage a very public, very messy breakup tomorrow night at the charity gala. You will humiliate him and you will walk away forever. If you do not, I leak this to the press, the merger collapses, Julian loses his empire, and I will personally make sure you spend the rest of your life paying off the legal fees when I sue you for breach of contract." Ilara stared at Silas, the cold reality of the threat wrapping around her throat like a vice. She had spent years hating Julian Vance, blaming him for the ruin of her family. But the thought of destroying him now, of letting a parasite like Silas win and take everything Julian had built, made her stomach turn in ways she did not understand. She was trapped, and the clock was ticking down to the final gala. The grand ballroom of the charity gala was a sea of flashing cameras and whispering elites. Ilara stood in a breathtaking midnight blue dress, her heart pounding a frantic rhythm against her ribs. Across the room, Silas raised his champagne glass in a mocking toast, a silent command for her to execute his plan. The overseas investors were seated at the front table, watching the golden couple with approving eyes. Julian stepped onto the stage, adjusting the microphone. He spoke about the future of Vance Global, about stability and vision, and then he extended his hand toward Ilara, inviting her to join him. Ilara walked up the steps, the heavy weight of the blackmail pressing down on her shoulders. She took the microphone from Julian, looking out at the glittering crowd. Silas smirked, waiting for her to tear Julian and his reputation to shreds. Instead, Ilara took a deep breath and looked directly at the lead investor. "My name is not just Ilara," she said, her voice steady and echoing through the silent ballroom. "I am Ilara Thorne, daughter of Richard Thorne, the founder of the maritime company Vance Global acquired 5 years ago." A shockwave of murmurs ripped through the crowd. Julian turned to her, his eyes wide with stunned confusion. The smug smile on the face of Silas vanished instantly, replaced by a pale mask of panic. "I was hired to stand here tonight," Ilara continued, refusing to break eye contact with the investors. "But I will not be used as a pawn to destroy the man beside me. Silas Vance, the vice president of this company, threatened to leak my identity and ruin this merger unless I publicly humiliated Julian tonight. He cares nothing for the stability of Vance Global, only for seizing power through extortion and sabotage. Silas lunged forward, shouting for the security team to cut the microphone, but Julian moved faster. He stepped in front of Ilara, a dangerous protective wall of pure authority. "You are finished, Silas," Julian said, his voice booming over the speakers, cold and absolute. "Security, escort my former vice president out of this building and contact the board. He is stripped of all shares and terminated immediately." The room erupted into chaos as security guards grabbed Silas, dragging him toward the exit while he screamed empty threats, completely humiliated and stripped of the empire he had tried to steal. The investors were on their feet, whispering furiously, but Julian ignored them all. He turned only to Ilara, his chest heaving, looking at her as if he was seeing her for the very first time. Hours later, the penthouse was completely silent. The merger was in limbo, but Julian did not seem to care. Ilara packed her small bag in the guest bedroom, knowing the contract was broken and the game was over. When she walked into the living room, Julian was waiting in the shadows. He did not ask her to stay. He did not offer an arrogant apology. Instead, he stepped forward and handed her a thick legal document. "What is this?" she asked, her voice exhausted. "I spent the last week tracking down every core asset of Thorn Maritime that I sold off," Julian said quietly, stripping away the armor he had worn his entire life. "I bought them back, all of them. They are in your name now. I cannot bring your father back, Ilara. I cannot undo the man I was. But I can spend the rest of my life helping you rebuild what I broke." Ilara looked at the papers, tears finally spilling over her lashes. She looked up at Julian, seeing the raw, unguarded truth in his dark eyes. He was not buying her forgiveness. He was surrendering his power to her. She dropped the folder onto the table and closed the distance between them, wrapping her arms tightly around his neck. Julian pulled her close, burying his face in her hair, breathing her in like she was oxygen. 1 year later, the ocean breeze whipped through the open windows of the newly established Thorn and Vance Maritime headquarters. Ilara stood at the head of the boardroom, reviewing the blueprints for their new sustainable shipping fleet. Julian sat beside her, not as the ruthless king of a solo empire, but as her partner in every sense of the word. They had built a new legacy, not on hostile takeovers, but on trust and a love that had survived the darkest of beginnings. As he reached out under the table to interlock his fingers with hers, she knew she had finally found her home. If this story touched your heart, share it with someone who needs to hear a good romance. Subscribe to the channel to follow our upcoming stories, and we will see you in the next chapter.